Hello, my name is Anthony Piccarello. I'm the Executive Director of the St. John Paul II National Shrine here in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Helen Alvaré, who is at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, and there she is the Robert A. Levy Endowed Chair in Law and Liberty. Welcome, Professor Alvaré.
Thank you.
On March 25th, 1995, the Feast of the Annunciation, Pope John Paul II issued his 11th encyclical letter, Evangelium Vitae, or the Gospel of Life. At over 48,000 words, it's not only his longest encyclical, but the longest encyclical before or since. And its exceptional size is really only matched by its exceptional impact on the life of the church. This year, 2025, marks its 30th anniversary, and here at the Shrine, we are celebrating that anniversary in various ways, including this conversation today. So, Professor Alvaré, thanks for joining us for that celebration. Really appreciate it.
I'm really delighted to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't we begin with a summary, if you might, just kind of give us like the 2-minute version. I realize,
Sure.
again, it's a beast. It's hard to put into 2 minutes, but if you can
Yeah.
kind of give us that sort of high-level overview, and then we
Sure.
can dig into the details beyond that.
So it came against a backdrop of a move away from the idea that killing was a tragedy to the idea that killing was a human right, and in particular, killing family members at their weakest. So the Pope felt very strongly that something needed to be said. So against all of that, what he was articulating were several things: that there is a scriptural, magisterial depth of teaching against the taking of human life. So he goes through all the scripture on it, that it is also completely amenable to reason, to know that when faced with another human life, you may not take it. He also did a fabulous analysis of the altered understandings of the human person and of freedom that had gotten us to what he considered a tragic and horrible place. He then extended out the scope of topics, not just regarding abortion, but to all taking of life. So he moved out to include euthanasia and capital punishment. And then he also did a little sort of context building for how we'd gotten to the abortion problem by talking about the contraceptive mentality and the idea that we can create life as we like, not just destroy it. So he addresses contraception and new reproductive technologies. He wants to assert that this teaching is unchangeable. He works his way up to this cannot be changed.
Right.
He then speaks to all of the people responsible, whether it's the individuals involved in taking of life, and to, in particular, lawmakers. And there's a long section. The context into which that came was the personally opposed, but I can favor abortion on demand without apology. And then finally, he talks about the campaign for life, which for him is never separate from a campaign for family and all that has to be done in that. And as one sort of cherry on the top for so many people, for me, I remember reading this on the way home from New York, where I picked it up on the train, his discussion of a new feminism for women and women's particular role in the pro-life movement, which the U.S. bishops had already gotten their fingers on, and we were celebrating. But now, talk about prescience.
Sure.
Now every major pro-life group is run by a woman. And he identified women's particular need to do that. So those were the major categories, and sort of every one of them was fabulous.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Let me pick up on one of them. You mentioned the weaving in of Christian anthropology. And as I revisited this document, again, after an early reading in 1995 and probably here and there since, but kind of going back at it systematically, it leapt out at me that he was rooting this all in the overall project of Christian anthropology, which started with Redemptor Homines, quote straight out of that, sort of little riffs on it.
Right.
And that idea that by focusing on the person of Christ, you don't just have a revelation about God, but you have a revelation about man. You understand more about the nature of the human person, the dignity of the human person. It's as he spins it out, it's easy to see how that ties in with the idea of the gospel of life. But if you could just say a few words about that.
Let me say first that, not only was he the Pope known for anthropology, but when I was working for the Bishops' Conference in the 90s, we had done this in-depth study and asked people, why are you pro-choice? They interviewed hundreds of people in qualitative interviews. And it always got down to understandings about the human person and what is freedom for the human person.
Right.
And here was this man going, I know.
Right.
And let me tell you how to speak into that.
Sure.
So, again, best understood by distinction, not just description. The context into which he was speaking had understood the human person, since the Enlightenment, essentially, let's blame the Enlightenment, as an autonomous individual who makes subjective judgments about right and wrong, who understands freedom to be, a one-person game. It's not about relationships, who has separated out the notion of freedom from truth and separated out the notion of freedom and the human person from the existence of God.
Right.
And so he marches through these. It's particularly in the 50s of these paragraphs, and then says, now let me tell you what the human person actually is. And he, articulates brilliantly the church's understanding that if you only see the world as a human sees it, you're missing most of reality.
Right.
So if you do not understand the human person in light of who Jesus is, who God is, that we are made in God's image and likeness, the life and work of Jesus, and his message for us, that you can't even understand yourself.
Right.
And there's a line in paragraph 49, and it says, the meaning of life is. Like the meaning of human. It reminded me, there was a Twilight Zone years ago, and the premise of it was that when people are informed about the meaning of the life, they lose their minds. Like a whole town is losing their mind because people have been whispering this to one another. And I remember when I came across that line, I'm like, he's going to do it. And he says, the meaning of life as people made in God's image and likeness is to recognize yourself as basically a gifted giver, is to give that life away, is you don't realize, or you have no possibility of living in who you are or understanding yourself or anyone else unless you understand Jesus on the cross. Mm-hmm. And that this is the height of the meaning of the human person.
Right.
And, JP2's theology of the gift,
Sure.
the person is gifted giver, he brings all of that to bear on the subject of, and now let me tell you how that works out when another vulnerable life has been entrusted to you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such a firm foundation in so many ways, but especially given the overall thrust of his pontificate. One of the other things that struck me, and again, it's part of the lexicon now, right? Culture of life, culture of death.
Yes.
Right. That term is so part of the mental furniture for Catholics these days.
Yes.
But it was really coined here. This is kind of where it kicked off. And of course, the distinction between life and death is fundamental. But this idea of culture of life, culture of death, it evokes, again, another broader theme about priority of culture, which, again, talks about it all the time. But we see how it hits the ground here when you're talking about the gospel of life, and you talk about the culture of life, the culture of death. Talk a little bit about that.
I don't know if you remember, but more than one newspaper, when this came out, and I believe the New York Times was one of them, said, well, you can't contradict the man. It is a culture of death. Wasn't referring to abortion.
Right.
They refused to put abortion in that constellation because that's who they were. But everybody looks around and says, there's some structures, which is, he uses the expression structures of sin, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a very Catholic moral, theological, and social teaching reflection. And he's talking about the things that are inbuilt in our culture. And of course, we recognize so much the United States in this, and the West as a whole, that things that are inbuilt that basically tip the balance in favor of death, which is so shocking. Right. And he says things like a culture of efficiency only, a culture of majority rule without, he says, you've made an idol of democracy. He goes, democracy is only so good as the ends that these majorities are trying to achieve. Right. The individualism in this culture, which he says it's nothing more than a war of the strong against the weak. I mean, these powerful phrases. The lack of attention to the vulnerable. He says all of these are now inbuilt.
Yeah.
And so the balance is tipped in favor of what should be horrible to you, that your conscience is darkened. I remember several years ago, I thought about this. There was a woman, in fact, she just got out of jail, a pro-life activist, who saw an abortion clinic throw away boxes of bodies, unburied bodies. And she stole them and had them buried. And she went to jail for years for this and was just pardoned. And the reaction of the press mostly was, how dare she steal?
Right.
And who does she think she is? The lack of a proper sense of horror
Right.
at a box of vulnerable human bodies. It's,
In a dumpster.
and so he was trying to say, you don't get that. That's not a single choice.
Right.
That is if culture is what we worship, what's the definition of culture? It's we build our lives around the things that are valuable to us. And if the only thing that's valuable to you is productivity, efficiency, individual choice, autonomy, then you're going to lose your conscience, and you're going to have a culture where you could possibly have that reaction to a box of corpses.
Right. And there's that element of focus on system. In other words, he's talking about institutions, organizations, things that, again, in the aggregate, as you say, darken the vision. They sort of distort the view because you're operating within this framework created by these structures. It's fascinating, and it's true. I mean, it just really resonates. I'd like to talk a little bit about the connection to family life in here, because, just as the culture of death is this sort of systemic skew in one direction, he calls for the formation of a culture of life. And it's sort of like the whole church effort, right? And I call on you.
Yes.
This and then this, and medical professionals and media and politicians, kind of goes through the litany. But it's almost there, but also like throughout, I think he talks about the family.
Oh, yes.
So this is kind of the real core institution. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would.
So a couple of things, so many come to mind. I mean, this just sets off all kinds of thoughts.
Sure.
He says at the zenith regarding the family at the end, he said, everything that is done in law and policy should have the well-being of the family as a priority.
That's the
everything. So one thinks about this. One thinks about the trajectory of the late 20th century, and first a constitutional right to contraception for the married, then a constitutional right for the single, then a right to abortion, then a constitutional right to non-marital sexual relations in the Lawrence case, then a statement that marriage is not for about men and women and children. It's about an individual realizing their social position by being told by the state, you can marry anybody you want, and we'll validate it, and this will be a giving to you, the individual, your civil rights. It's so dismantled the idea that the family was a natural good, that it had an important social role to play. I've read accounts of the 20th century that talk in particular about systems like communism or other totalitarianisms, where they were like, how come people aren't realizing their own desire to rise up and destroy the state and have a proletariat nirvana? The family and the church is getting in our way, because these communal institutions,
boy, are they stubborn.
are stubborn, and people are prevented from knowing their own individual good because they are held down by family and church, as opposed to what we now know, right? Family law, which is always intersecting with anthropology, sociology, health, is my area. We know that the thing that will most make or break you, many factors in life are important, but is the formation of you in a family that is or is not the school of love. Mm-hmm. Are you made out of love, for love? Are you treated as a gift? Does the family bring Christ to you? Or Are you impaired? Are you in a situation where it's very hard to get the stable love of two parents, where you can't be loved properly as you're growing up, where you then enter the world as an adult with this being hobbled? The idea that the family is, some sort of like Republican talking point, or that it's like sort of people who want to impose their values on you, as distinguished from the single most important thing you could do for a vulnerable person, for the poor, for minority, for the rich, right? One final point on this. When I spent a year, because of one of the bishops who was head of the pro-life committee, interviewing post-aborted women, and the abortion was always traced back to some familial issue. The abortion was never a woman's desire to be rid of a human life, right? It was always, what was the deal with her family of origin? Did the boyfriend say if she had the abortion, he would still love her, and the other way, no? Did she have this idea of her future that could or could not accept a child now? What did she think her role as a woman was? Did motherhood frighten her? What was her own experience as a child? A culture of life is a culture of the family. It's because life has been good to you. You've been raised in the school of love. You've been capacitated to give love. This is why when I left the pro-life office, I went into family law. Abortion is never a single issue. By itself, it is always about, what do we think about the family? Are we willing to accept new life? What does it mean to be a mother and a father? And so when he identifies family again and again, it's crucial. It's why, a tiny percentage of abortions are in marriages, and the rest are not. The family is the school of love. The family is the place that protects life. It's not rocket science. It's where people feel the freedom and the ability to accept a child because they're already in a community.
Right. It's key.
I could go on, so stop
No,
me.
it's true. It's the sanctuary of life indeed. Okay. There are so many other things that we could talk about in this document, but there's one in particular I wanted to tease out before we wrap up, and it has to do with the relationship between the moral law and the civil law. There's a long discussion of that that's kind of in a discrete section, but again, it's another one of these things like the family where it pervades. It shows up everywhere.
Yes.
And that originates in this particular context because we have such a radical break in so many places, including here, between what the moral law requires and what the civil law allows or authorizes or supports. But then that's kind of the launching off point. In other words, he ends up giving sort of like a primer on church-state relations.
He does.
There's
this
element of like conscientious objection, the nature of law. When is a law not a law because it's an unjust law? It goes not on in a rambling sense, but you can see how that problem of the disjunction between the moral law and the civil law in this especially important area has very wide implications because all of this is germane that he talks about. So again, if you have thoughts about that.
Sure. And again, the context is so helpful here because we were entering it used to be you had a lot of people from all political parties who were pro-life.
Right.
Then it started to split off in the 90s, and there were, fewer and fewer and fewer pro-life Democrats, and the Republican Party saw this opportunity that, wow, the pro-life movement is a heck of a grassroots force, let's go with it. And there were all of these speeches. I actually teach in my seminar these speeches where various politicians say, I'm pro-life, but. So, of course, the classic Mario Cuomo speech. And you even hear the, relationship between church-state speech more generally, John Kennedy, Mario Cuomo. Interestingly, Senator Lieberman made one when he was running. Barack Obama made such a speech. Mitt Romney made such a speech. Now they're just petered out. They're like, nobody cares about my religion. We're not even going to talk about it. But John Paul II is speaking against a backdrop of, listen, something can be morally horrific even, but there's not a majority of people, to stop it. So I'm going to have to go with that.
Right.
And he launched his discussion of the relationship between the divine law and the civil law. his absolute denunciation of the personally opposed but position, his relativizing of democracy. It's in the end, democracy is a system. It's not a god, and it's not a moral precept all on its own. He goes, it's a great thing. We're moving in that direction. Don't get me wrong, he says. But it's only as good as its best values, and it's as bad as its worst. Yeah. And he talks about things like imperfect legislation and the ability to support something that would move you in the right direction, so long as it doesn't involve you in simultaneously affirming a bad thing, or that's the best you can do and you'll never get any better. And he invites, which I love, and which has always been a practice of the U.S. bishops when they testify, which I loved, to bring faith and reason together when you come to politics. To say, why should religion sit in the back of the bus? To start by saying, hey, everyone in this room, lawmaker, knows there's a natural case to be made for this position against euthanasia or against abortion or against capital punishment. And I will also tell you why it is supported and affirmed by and even illuminated by the faith. But there's a natural case to make, which would be enough for you, even if you set the faith aside. And it's for anybody, if you were a student in college or grad school wondering about the relationship between the divine and the civil law, he basically makes Aquinas readable for you.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's very concise, even as it treats kind of major, weighty subjects. So I lied a little bit. I want to address another topic that builds on this one, especially in light of Dobbs. As I was reading through the sections that were focusing on democracy and sort of subjecting this principle to sort of democratic process, that came right to mind. I mean, in a way, I have to say, out of the chute, thank God for Dobbs, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does move the question to shifting fragile and already variable democratic majorities. So again, I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
I'll tell you, I mean, my heart has been broken so many times since Dobbs came down to see Kansas, Ohio.
Right.
Like, these places are not New York and California. What is happening here? It shows you a couple things. It shows you that a culture of death that reigned in law for almost 50 years has its effects. That law is a teacher. And frankly, that just talking about rights, the rights of the child, they'll say, well, it's against the rights of the woman, and but women have been discriminated against and so forth. So we got to go with her, which is how abortion rights is portrayed. To me, this is the reason for the Catholic Church to be extraordinarily visible in making the case, to start with reason, but to double down on the faith case. I think some people will tell me they think I'm absolutely wrong, that this will drive people away. But you know what? People respond to inspiring and difficult messages. And everybody knows this is a human life we're destroying now. To me, I wrote an editorial last fall, and I took it right out of I took it out of JP2's playbook. And I said, I would like the Catholic Church to begin saying, okay, country, can we just have a moment of your attention here? Can we talk to can you set aside the word abortion for a second and the politics and just give us a listen? We are talking about vulnerable human life. We are talking about the person to whom it's entrusted being the exact person who has the authority to destroy it. What does that do to her, let alone the life that's being destroyed? We are talking about the ability to destroy being allowed only when life is at its most vulnerable. And we're talking about calling this a human right. The U.S. Bishops' Faithful for Life document that followed up on this added the additional reflection. What does it mean when only family can kill each other?
Right. Sure.
Euthanasia, abortion. And, people wring their hands about the state of the United States, individualist or consumerist, or whether they think we're great on the world stage or a bully on the world stage, whether they worry about if we've lost the love for the differences between us and the, give me you're tired, you're poor, whether we've just become, a product of Instagram and X and TikTok and whatever Walmart is selling on sale this week, and we have to rush there and get it. I want this concern about, oh my gosh, I mean, the stuff of human life is loving and being loved. I want to put that in that constellation of where the heck are we going? And say, okay, that happens to describe the abortion issue. It also happens to describe euthanasia issue in many respects. Can we worry about this together?
Right. Turn the focus there as opposed to all these other things. Yes. Right.
The Europeans once had a fabulous campaign. You may recall it. It was just called One of Us. And I teach, law and religion. I get misty when I see people of different faiths getting along together.
Right.
When I see, at my law school, Catholics and Jews and Muslims standing together for something.
Right.
There's something really beautiful about that. And there's something really beautiful about accepting a child in difficult circumstances. We all know it's gorgeous and heroic. We all say so. I want that conversation. The conversation of battling rights when one of them is associated with feminism, which has, many beautiful faces, but this particular strand of it is loaded with money. He even notes that, the money's all on the other side. Right. I loved having him on my side. I was like, thank you for saying so. You're definitely like one of the smartest guys on the planet. Everybody thinks, here's a man with a moral compass and no vested interests. Right. And to have him on our side. And
willing to call it out, too.
Willing to call it out and saying, I know we're poor, but we're right, and we're doing something beautiful. I want to see that conversation. It's everybody's right. It's a baby. The ultrasound is important. It's horrible, the actual process of taking this life. But what about the whole question of our future direction? And doesn't this belong as a central element of it?
Sure. Well, again, the project of building a culture of life is ongoing, and it seems like kind of a central dimension of it. Unfortunately, we're not already there, right? Got to keep on slogging through.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Professor, thank you so much for this conversation. As with every single other discussion like this, I felt like I could go on and on and on. I think let's leave it here for now and just maybe encourage folks to revisit the document themselves, maybe over a long period of time because it is so big, but it pays back. It certainly pays back. But I was hoping you might be willing to conclude us with a prayer, perhaps the prayer that concludes the document.
Yeah, I would love to.
Thank you.
And of course, it's a John Paul II prayer invoking Mary, which is so characteristic of him. Oh, Mary, a bright dawn of the new world, mother of the living, to you we entrust the cause of life. Look down, O Mother, upon the vast numbers of babies not allowed to be born, of the poor whose lives are made difficult, of men and women who are victims of brutal violence, of the elderly and the sick killed by indifference or out of misguided mercy. Grant that all who believe in your Son may proclaim the gospel of life, with honesty and love to the people of our time. Obtain for them the grace to accept that gospel as a gift ever new, the joy of celebrating it with gratitude throughout their lives, and the courage to bear witness to it resolutely in order to build, together with all people of goodwill, the civilization of truth and love to the praise and glory of God, the creator and lover of life. Amen.
Amen. Thanks.
Thank you.